Hey everybody! Hope everybody's having a great Kanji so far. If you don't know me, I'm Nick. I'm Nick T, and I've done a couple panels here before, usually secretly teaching you things. And today I'm just coming full mask off and telling you I'm just teaching lessons today. Um, in fact, we're going to be talking about the secret lessons of video games. Also the like not so secret. Sometimes you have plans and they don't work out. That's totally okay. I am going to be talking about the secret lessons of video games and the not so secret, but a couple ground rules in the style of the panel today, because we're taking on a sort of a classroom aesthetic. These are not classroom rules; they're just guidelines. Today we're going to be talking about games that are that are not focused on learning. I don't know how many of you grew up with games like Carmen Sandiego or Mario is Missing. We're not talking about games like that. Those games are pretty straightforward in what they're trying to teach you. Teaching you about traveling countries and things like that. I guess Kerbal Space Program, you could learn about physics. We're not talking about that anyway. Doesn't matter. We're mostly talking about implicit learnings. So games that have either like a little, hey, did you know this? Or something that's like, a theme that you might not pick up on. But sometimes I had a hard time. So we're going to talk about explicit learnings. It's just like the game is telling you this. If you didn't pick it up, you might have missed the point. I don't plan on spoiling anything, especially for something like what we're talking about today, but just in case you've been warned, because that can happen. Late in the process of making this panel, I was like, how does this compare to like the Ontario Secondary School Diploma? Can we get a bunch of the compulsory credits in here? So I'm actually going to try, and maybe not succeed, to give you a well-rounded education. But I can also only talk about games that I've played, because it's really hard to talk about things that you don't know about. And also, I'm not a teacher. That is not my profession, so that in one sense there's that, but I also mean that this is not a real classroom. There are not going to be tests. You are not going to be graded. None of that is happening right now. There's just like a fun little aesthetic that we're going to use to explore things. Also, today in the lessons that I talk about are mostly going to be focused on STEM. This is not because it's better than arts, philosophy, etc. It's because that's what I know. And if you don't know, STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and man, I love video games. No, it stands for mathematics. So a lot of the lessons that we talk about today are going to be about those subjects, although I did try to find other things to round us off. The inspiration for this panel was a game called Zero Escape, actually a series of games, Zero Escape, which is Zero Escape, 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors, Virtue's Last Reward, and Zero Time Dilemma. Partly because as a set of visual novels, they just say, hey, did you know this thing? And you have to try to figure out, is this a real thing that exists in the world? Or is this something that the game made up to try to tell us something about the narrative? Because sometimes the game would say like, oh, there was this guy, he was an obsessive collector about all things related to the Titanic. So he bought the Gigantic, a sister ship of the Titanic. And you just kind of be like, is that real? Did that really happen? And the short version is like, yes, but it was probably renamed to the Olympic. But like every time you're playing this game, you're like, is this real? Is this made up? I don't know. And so I wanted to try to pick out some of the real things from that game, but also other games to talk about them. And we're going to start off by eating our vegetables. Vegetables don't always taste the greatest, but you got to get all those macronutrients. And so we're going to start off with mathematics, not everybody's favorite subject, I know, but it's okay, because I'm going to start us off with something easy. And we're going to start off by talking about math through the lens of a very popular game right now called Balatro. If you haven't, for whatever reason, been exposed to or played this game, the short version is it's kind of like poker. It's kind of like if you mixed poker with, if you're familiar with other board games, there's a game called Flux where you change the rules all the time. But also if you mixed it with an arcade game. Yeah, slot machine poker, kind of. So it's like poker, except for all the ways that it's not. What are those jokers doing there? Why do some of the cards look different? Why is there a high score? And what is going on? I will talk about the bits that matter, but we're mostly going to use this as a lens to talk about math. And we're going to start by talking about really easy math. I swear, at least the first bit will be easy math. Okay. Folks probably either implicitly or explicitly know some of this stuff about math. Order of operations, I feel like, comes up an awful lot of the time. You know, whether you're in the North America or the UK, it's either BEDMAS, brackets, exponents, division, multiplication, addition, subtraction, and you do those in the order that they come. Or PEDMAS, which is parentheses. Same idea. You get it. I'm not being pedantic here. But there's also some rules in math that I think I was taught, but I don't remember at all. And now are just intrinsic to how I do math and maybe to how you do math as well. There's this thing called the commutative law, which is, you know, if you change the order of the arguments for certain operations, it doesn't matter. A plus B is the same either way. It works. We're 2 hours late for pedantry. Oh, I missed that, unfortunately. There's the associativity law, which, you know, if you have a set of operations, you can group them differently, doesn't change the end result. And the distributive law, which if you've ever had to do algebra, if you've ever had to refactor things, that's saying like you can distribute the operations. You can do A times B plus C is the same as A times B plus A times C. I explain this for reasons that I'm not sure about, because we're going to talk about how Balatro teaches us about math, and the answer is it kind of doesn't. it kind of doesn't. The biggest lesson that we can learn from Balatro is kind of about the order of operations, but also not really. It only deals with addition and multiplication, and the order actually maybe doesn't matter. It mostly does things left to right, which this is more of a, hey, if you're learning to play Balatro, the order of things matters. It does kind of follow the commutative law and the associative laws, but it turns out that those don't matter too much in the game. And the distributive law doesn't really come up. We're not doing refactoring. We're not doing things like that. And so we don't really have to worry about that. But as an example, there are a bunch of jokers there at the top row. It doesn't matter if you don't understand them or how the scoring works, but you can see, like, I've annotated them with like chips and multiplier. And if you arrange the cards one way, you get like plus 100 and plus 29. If you arrange them a different way, you get plus 100 and plus 34.5. So like the order of the operations in this case does matter. This is like an anti-lesson. I'm doing a fake out to mess you up before I talk about real math. Clay, Final Fantasy taught me the highest possible number is 9,999. There's literally no number greater than that. Well, I mean, I don't think we're going to talk about any numbers bigger than that either, so you're in luck. So this being an anti-lesson, okay, let's dive a little deeper into math, real math, and we'll again use Balatro as the lens, just because we're already talking about it. Okay. Balatro, if you haven't played it, is a single-player game. If you're playing poker, you're actually playing against different other people, and the way that it generally works is like you win a hand if you stayed in, and your card was a higher rank, or if your hand was a higher rank than somebody else's. Balatro maintains this idea, which is that higher-ranking hands are worth more points. That kind of makes sense. And higher ranking hands are higher ranking because they are less likely to happen. A straight flush, as an example there, is like all of the cards are the same suit, and they follow rank from like ace to 10, or like king to 9, or the easier example like 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, something like that. As an example, we can use this to talk a little bit about probability. There's a whole bunch of math there. Don't worry if it doesn't make sense. I'm going to quickly walk through it because we've got other lessons that we get to, and math is hard. For what it's worth, I didn't remember this math. I had to look up some of it. And in fact, if you haven't taken some high school mathematics, you might not even know what the heck these symbols are. The weird round brackets are a thing called choose notation. And it's like, if I have 13 elements and I choose one, how many different ways can I choose those where the order doesn't matter? So 1, 2 is the same as 2, 1, as an example. And so if you wanted to figure out when you're playing the game, like, ooh, which of these is more likely, like, should I go for this? You can do the math. You can say, like, there are 13 cards, A through 2, or ace through 2, and I choose one of them consistently for a 4 of a kind. You have to choose 4 of the same, and then there's 48 cards left over. And you do the math, badly boom, your odds are not very good. And it turns out, if we're talking about secret lessons of games, this also isn't a great one. I'm really faking you out here to get us started. Because in Balatro, you can actually change the odds of the game. You can discard cards to make certain hands more likely. You can make certain hands more likely because you can duplicate cards. It's weird, it's wonky, but it's the math that we're using to get things started. So far, so good. Okay. One last math lesson. I swear, I don't remember there being any more math after this, but we're going to do a little bit more math because, as it turns out, in the curriculum, you need like 3 math credits. So sorry, we're doing what we have to. There is a game from Zero Escape, which is what I mentioned earlier. 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors. It's the first game in the series, and they use this one concept in the game, this one mathematical tool, very extensively. And that is the idea of digital roots. If this isn't a thing you've heard of, that makes sense because it's not generally a thing you would ever use in real life, but it is pivotal to the plot of this particular game. How pivotal? It comes up in conversation a lot. People can rattle off this math like nobody's business. It determines the routes that you take in the game. It's kind of cool, but it's very gimmicky. And what a digital root is effectively you take a number like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the digital root of it is what happens when you continue to add the numbers until you don't have any numbers left. You add them up. And so, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is 15 if you add the digits, which is 1 plus 5, which is 6. Okay, weird thing to include in a game, but it's what we got. Play. The Street Fighter games taught me how to count to. Oh, right, yeah. Game series are not sequential. We're going to take a little step aside. We're like, okay, digital roots, we're going to put them over here. We're going to talk about division. And this is pretty basic stuff. You probably encountered this before. Division, how many times can I fit some number into a different number? It's repeated subtraction. 5 divided by 2 is 2.5. If you go way back to, like, I don't know, grade 4, grade 3, you sort of learned something called integer division, which is like, how many times can I fit this number in? And I had leftovers if there was some remainder. And if we do that, the integer division of 5 divided by 2 is 2. And then there's no decimal part. It's just there's 1 left over. At Finance is writing down math. We're gonna. I swear there will be other topics, but I'm pretty math heavy. Integer division and digital roots kind of lead into this concept called modular arithmetic. And as it turns out, this is something you use every day, whether or not you think about it. A great example of this is a clock. If it's 9 o'clock and you're like, I have something in 4 hours from now, most people here in North America would not say, oh, well, that event takes place at 13 o'clock. They would say that it takes place at 1 o'clock. And the reason that they would say that is because 1 o'clock, which is 13, is 13 by modular arithmetic of 12. It's 1. If you work in 24-hour time, this is the same reason that you're like, oh, I know that 1800 hours is actually 6 p.m. because 18 mod 12 is 6. Dan, we've learned something today. I'm going to teach you whether you all like it or not. We're not turning this panel around until someone has learned something. Okay, last bit about modular arithmetic, and then we'll move on. Actually, there's one other slide, but it's quick because math is hard. Modular arithmetic is the idea that if I divide A by B, what's the remainder? And as it turns out, why you use this doesn't come up every day. It's used a lot in things like cryptography to ensure that secrets remain secret. Your browser is probably using it very indirectly right now to maintain a secure connection to Twitch. But as far as we're talking about it, none of that. Digital roots, from Zero Escape, which is what I started talking about, are actually a special case of modular arithmetic. In particular, a digital root of a number is effectively the number mod 9. So the digital root of 10 is 1, 10 mod 9 is 1. They're the same. And so that's kind of neat. That comes up in other contexts, but when I dug into it deeper, it's still a lot of math, which you probably haven't come up with, which is cool. But it also comes up when you're talking about divisibility. And I remember proving this in an introductory university course on math, but that math is hard. So all you need to know is that you can use modular arithmetic to figure out, like, is a number divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, any arbitrary number, which is neat, but too complicated. So let's keep things moving. Also, like, did you know some of these things? You're like, what's the fun one? Like the 7 one. Isn't that weird? It's weird. Technology, as it turns out, is also in the curriculum. So we're going to talk about it. And by talk about it, I mean, I'm going to give you some suggested reading here, because these games that I've listed are a little on the nose. And today we want to talk more about secret lessons. But it turns out there are a lot of games that teach you about technology and in particular programming. So I'm just going to list a bunch of them here. As an example, these games all kind of fit the bill, but have different themes. So if you wanted to learn programming, you could try out Exapunks. Exapunks is like cyberpunk, literally need to hack systems to live, whether that's hacking your medication to work better, hacking your biotechnology so that it works more efficiently, robbing a bank. But you do this by like programming little droney things, which is cool. There's also Shenzhen.io, which is kind of like making real circuits in the real world. That's actually closer to reality than some of these other ones. Common 64 is like programming your Commodore 64 back in the 80s, if that was a thing you were alive for / had. Factorio is still programming, but it's kind of like Hack the Planet because you're building a giant planet scale factory. Duskers is kind of a horror themed programming game. Programming isn't required, but you have to input commands in a terminal, and you can make little macros to like speed things up, but you're like scavenging from other ships. And I'm going to say Space Chem is also programming, because you're like building a factory of building up chemical elements, and you're not specifically writing programming commands, but it's kind of the same. These are all puzzly games that teach you broadly about technology. That's part of your technology credit today. But if we wanted to actually maybe learn something instead of me hand waving and say, go play these games and you'll learn things, we can talk a little bit. We want to talk a little bit about technology, and in particular a concept known as graph theory, and just a bit, because like this is sort of math, sort of computer science, and I said I was done with math, and we're almost done with math. Math is very broad, covers linguistics too. We're going to talk about graph theory, and we're going to do that via a game called Copy Editor. Copy Editor, a regex puzzle. The game is kind of like, it is a puzzle game. There is a light narrative about you being a copy editor, and you need to correct a bunch of mistakes. Sorry, this game is a little bit more like real life. Early levels in the game, you literally just find and replace, like we want to put all of these words in the past tense. So find every time we say have, and replace it with had, is, and replace it with was. And as a game, that's kind of boring. So the game increases the difficulty, and it actually introduces something that happens that is used in the real world. It introduces this idea of what are called regular expressions. It goes from something like what it was to this. And as you might be able to see, it might be a little hard to make out on screen. You got like these weird like /* dot plus question mark, and it looks like nonsense. It looks, you're like, I don't know what any of these symbols mean. This is some arcane language. But we can use it to talk about graphs, which I will show in a second. Hey, 7 Deadly Streamers, welcome. And when I say graphs, I don't mean graphs like this bar chart, which is, I guess, also a graph. I'm not really clear. People use them interchangeably. We're talking about graphs like the thing on the right-hand side. And in fact, the kind of graph on the right is called a railroad graph. And it's called that because you can kind of think of yourself as a little train on the track, and you go through the graph, and you start at the one node on the left and you end at the one node on the right. And so that graph actually represents the regular expression that's just below it, which is like bracket, nect, question mark, etc. In fact, I made a typo in here, so it's wrong, but you get the idea. If I wanted to, for an example, I had a document and I wanted to replace all instances of my name with like the author, I could write this regular expression and it would find any instance of Nick or nect or enterp, and it would capture that, which is kind of cool. In that sense, we're like traversing a graph, which comes up a lot in other graph theory, but that's too much math. There are other kinds of graphs, but I'm going to start moving us closer towards real life. This is a railroad diagram for part of a programming language, a language called JSON. It defines what an object looks like, and you don't have to trace through it. That's fine. I just want to illustrate that, like, oh, programming languages can be complicated, and that's true, but how they are formalized in graphs is not necessarily that hard. And in fact, you can make graphs of other languages too, like English and English sentences. This is what's called a syntax tree. And it's the syntax tree for an English sentence: the little bear saw the fine, fat trout in the brook, which is a mouthful of a sentence, but it's an example. And you can see it's abbreviated, but like S is like, this is a subject. NP is like, this is a noun phrase. This is a verb phrase. This is a participle phrase. I don't know. If you've taken grammar in school, you might have done sentence diagramming, and this is kind of like that. And what's interesting is you have a tree, you have a graph, you use these implicitly all of the time, and you don't necessarily even know that you're using them. This is also a reason why you might see a sentence that's written weirdly and you're like, oh, it doesn't make sense. And it's probably because mentally you have this syntax tree in your head and it doesn't parse, it doesn't fit. So that's kind of neat. That's cool. Like, you can learn a practical skill, regular expressions that the game teaches you can actually use, but also you learned a little bit of English and language. So that's fun. I'm going to count this as an English credit. So too bad. English credit, baby. Geography. We can cover geography. I'm sure there's a game that teaches us about geography. I can't ever remember if that's the one where you're learning about, like, here are where the countries are, or if that's the one where we build societies and cities. And I definitely remember a geography class in high school where we talked about that. But we're going to talk about the geography that people know about, and we're going to do that via Katamari Damacy. And in Katamari, at the end of the game, your goal in Katamari is to roll up all this trash, which are people and stuff, because your dad got fabulously drunk and destroyed lots of the stuff in the universe, which is cool. Carmen Sandiego, Mario's missing. At the beginning of the panel, I'm like, we're not doing the obvious cases, but those are good examples too. Also, Where in Time is Carmen Sandiego. Yeah, so like Katamari, you can roll up the countries at the end of the game. So like you can learn your countries through Katamari Damacy, and you can learn astronomy because you can roll up the planets. I'm not convinced by this. No, we're not learning geography from Katamari Damacy. Oh my god. We're going to learn about geography through civilization. We're going to talk about a little bit, very briefly, about geography in the sense of like how our settlements formed. And you might be asking, like, Nick, civilization has like, Cleopatra, and it has Gandhi, and it has Napoleon, and it has Washington. Isn't it like more of a history lesson? And I'm going to stop you right there. It's any game where Gandhi wants to go to war with you, wants to nuke your country, is probably not a history lesson game. Admittedly, this is like a bug from early versions of the game. Gandhi's aggression was actually super low, and if you did something, it would actually go lower, and it would flip over to the highest aggression. But any game where Gandhi is super aggressive like this is probably not a great history lesson. So let's use civilization as talking about building settlements and things. Sometimes games are hard to teach lessons because they're so good at what they do. This is, I believe, from Civilization 2. And it's that little area that's circled is like, this is the resources that are available around your city. And when you see that, you don't even think about why things are that way. You don't think like, oh, why is there more food here? Why is there more of this? You're just like, I want to maximize the numbers. Modern versions of the game do a bit better of a job of this. It's easier to read everything for sure. But you might still be wondering, like, why does this city have more access to food? They're just icons that you want to maximize. Later, yeah, Baba Yetu. You might want to know, like, oh, why is there more food here? Why is there not? Why is this a better place to build a city, to build a settlement, etc.? And implicitly, doesn't do a great job explicitly. You just, again, number go up. The game is teaching you some important lessons that we've learned from early civilizations, like Mesopotamia, India, China, Egypt, all places that are in river valleys or near rivers and different things like that. And the reason a lot of those civilizations formed in those places is because they have access to things that you need to survive, unsurprisingly. If you think of your basics, food, water, shelter, like you need to build shelter, but in terms of water, fresh water is water you can drink. Food, if you have fresh water, there's usually wildlife in there, or wildlife is coming to the water source that you might hunt it or otherwise consume it. River valleys tend to be places that have really fertile land. So if you are an agrarian society, you can grow things there. There might just naturally be sources of food or other resources that are there. It's a defensive location. If there's a river there, you can't necessarily cross it. You might have to ford it. And anybody who's played the Oregon Trail knows that that's not always an easy thing to do. It also serves as a source of transportation. If you could build boats, you can go up and down river quickly, more quickly than going on land. Even if you can't, a river is kind of like a road. You could walk along the river to get to different places. You can define and capture trade routes. You can do all that stuff with rivers and river valleys. If you are near mountains or the ocean, you have other benefits. You have defense. Nobody's going to come from the ocean, at least not early on. If you have mountains, it's like, well, nobody's going to go through the mountains. That'd be ridiculous, unless you're Hannibal. And also, when you have things like mountains, it's easier to get access to things like create mines, or there's natural caverns, and you can get resources from there, like iron or whatnot. Civilization doesn't directly address these things. Like, you would never be like, oh, how did you come up with this? But the game implicitly does this. It by showing you where things on the map are. How are we doing for time? We got time. We got lots of time. Okay, let's talk about art. I said that I was mostly going to focus on STEM, but I am going to talk about art. I'm not good at art. I haven't studied art. I don't know art history, although there's some fascinating bits, in particular about perspective. Like, it wasn't used for a long time, not because we didn't know any better, because it wasn't taught, but because it's like, I forget, it's like, this is God's work. Doesn't matter. We're not talking about that. We're going to talk about perspective. And the game that we're going to use to talk about perspective is actually a game that isn't about art at all. It's a game called Superliminal. Superliminal is a puzzle game where you're in this dream therapy experience, or it might be an experiment. Really, it's both. I can't remember. It's been a little while since I played the game. It's a game mostly about all of these different optical illusions, this like dreamlike quality as you're exploring your trauma or something. I'm not being dismissive of therapy. I just literally don't remember. But what's important when we're talking about art is that the optical illusions that the game uses can teach us an important concept about perspective, or a little bit about perspective, secretly. Quick thing, why do we use perspective at all in art? Well, a lot of it is because when objects are in a 3D space, like, they obviously have depth you might not be able to see because you're on the other side of the camera, you're watching this from a screen. But when I move my hand closer to the camera, I am physically moving it in 3D space. But in a 2D space, that's not true. You just kind of have to guess. All you can see is that my hand is getting bigger. Your brain knows that I'm sitting in front of a camera and moving it around in 3D space, but who knows? My head could actually be getting larger. You don't know that. If it was a 3D model, that could definitely be the case. But in general, when we're doing perspective, we're projecting a 3D model into a 2D space. 2D spaces don't have real depth, so we have to fake it. Superliminal has some examples that make this really, really apparent. For example, early in the game, and this is where the screenshot is from, you can see this weird cube. It's painted on the wall, and you're like, what the heck is going on here? I don't understand what I'm looking at. And so you kind of move around the room, and eventually you line yourself up just so, and you're like, oh, it looks exactly like a cube. That's neat. But it turns out that it doesn't look exactly like a cube. It is, in fact, a cube, because this is a dream and the rules are all made up. Unlike in art, where the perspective is just handling projection, the cube becomes a real thing. And that's kind of neat. I'm going to stop for a second, get myself some water. If you have not been hydrated, you should stay hydrated. Okay, cool. We're not done with art, and we're not done with superliminal either. Okay, but we are going to take a little bit of a detour. That's kind of related to perspective. It's kind of related. So I mentioned that when you take a 3D space and you project it into 2 dimensions, things change. A great example of this is in animation. Animation isn't real. You have a still picture and a series of still pictures, and by playing them quickly, it appears that something is moving, but they're just still pictures. There's nothing actually really moving around. I know this happens in video games. I couldn't find a good example of it. This also happens in 3D, where there are things that we see that look real, and we have to like do things to make it work. Animation is about tricking your brain into converting 2D images into motion. 3D objects may obey real rules in 3D, but things don't always look right. If you've seen Encanto, this is where I was leading up to this. You might remember this scene, and Mirabelle's like holding this shattered vision from Bruno, and it looks pretty natural, right? Like you're like, I can imagine this woman standing here like this. And I think the camera does this like zoom for dramatic effect. And it's like it's neat, and you're like, of course, this is really easy, and I can understand this. But things that are projected into 2-dimensional spaces don't always make sense when you have to apply them in 3D. And so I believe this is from the Bird site from Twitter, which is one of the animators demonstrating how they got the effect to work correctly. When you draw things with foreshortening, you're literally removing, like when my arm is like this, you don't draw the part of my arm that you can't see. You have to like hide it. And in 3D, sometimes you have to do things like this to make the final result, the 2D projection, make sense. This seems kind of weird and unrelated, but it kind of lays us up for another concept that Superliminal uses, which we can also apply in real life. You've probably seen not a million, but you've probably seen photos of folks that have, they're holding up the Eiffel Tower, they're like plucking it up, or they're propping up the Tower of Pisa, or it's even like an ice cream cone. I don't know. Or like, this guy's a giant, or this woman is in the palm of my hand. And some of them are Photoshop and some of them are not. But all of those use this technique called forced perspective. Because we're taking 3D images where people could be in the foreground, in the background, whatever. And because we're doing that, we can use forced perspective to give the illusion that things are not as they seem because of, again, that flattening. That's also why if you've ever talked to a photographer, they'll say like to giraffe your chin out because it's going to get flattened in the image. Lord of the Rings. Yeah, that's another good one. There's a famous director, Michel Gondry, whose whole thing, I think if you've seen Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, there's like the scene where adults, Jim Carrey is walking around a table, but he looks so freaking tiny. He looks like a child, and they use forced perspective for that. Superliminal takes us to the next level because you might pick up something like a chess piece to examine it, and this is a great example. In this photo, is the rook very close to my face because I'm examining it, or is it really large? As it turns out, the game doesn't care. Some items, when you pick them up and bring them up close and then let go of them, the forced perspective goes from being a projection to just being real. So if you bring the piece up close, it just becomes a big thing, a really big thing. The game does all sorts of crazy stuff like this. Climbing the Giant. Yeah, exactly. It is a great game. You should check it out if you haven't. It's also not very long, and I think they added a multiplayer mode to it, which I haven't checked out yet. But it demonstrates the idea of forced perspective. Okay. You didn't think I was going to get a health and phys ed credit in here, but I am. But not probably in the way that you're thinking. We're not going to talk about like Wii Sports or DDR or Just Dance or whatever thing moves. PlayStation Move. I don't know. We're not talking about any of those things. We are going to talk about boundaries, and we're going to do that via a game called Say No More, or I guess it's Say No More. We're kind of leaning into the health part of this, and in particular, the mental health part of this. Say No More is a self-titled world's first no-playing game. It's a game where you're an intern that says no to things. And sometimes that saying no is like just a simple no. Sometimes it's a big no. Sometimes it's a charge up a devastating laser blast of no. Yes, you can also learn how to say no in a lot of different languages, which is cool. It's fun. And the lesson here is not about saying no. It's about the friends we made along the way. No, it's absolutely not. It's about saying no. The game's pretty straightforward about that. This is not one of the games where the lesson is super secret. In the game, you can move and you can say no. That's pretty much it. But no isn't just a no, as in I don't want to do that. It also means kind of rejecting certain truths. For example, you encounter this one character and they're like, I'm too scared to dance. Well, no could mean like you may say no as a character, but that kicks off a discussion with the person and they're like, oh, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't be that scared. That could also be like your boss telling you you're supposed to be working. And you can say to that, no. And he's just kind of not sure what to do about it. Or somebody telling you it's like overtime time, like, heck, no. Devastating. That guy is upside down. I'm presenting this in a little bit of a jokey sort of way. But the game itself is actually really touching and it teaches. I'm not going to, I haven't dug into it lately, but you should play it. It's a short game because it really does talk a lot about setting clear boundaries, rejecting useless things. And it talks a little bit about stopping capitalism, which I think was a popular thing last night. It's been a little while, but it is a fantastically solid game. And as somebody mentioned, you can pick the language. So if you want to say no in different languages, you can do that. And they got a lot of languages to pick from. Okay, we're going to go back to Zero Escape for a second because there's a lot of stuff and I'm like, this is made up. If this were high school, the language would actually be a French credit. I could not think of anything that would be a French lesson, so too bad. Let's imagine that you have these words, they're nonsense, and these shapes. I am asking you, chat, if you had to associate different words with one of the symbols, what word would you associate with which? We're going to try to run a very quick experiment while I drink some water again. But then I will reveal the impetus of what this is for. Sorry, Kiki is left, Maluma on the right. Okay. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? We don't have time to do like a huge poll of this. Kiki and Takeda are sharp words, sharp sounds. Okay, cool. This is great. This is fantastic. As it turns out, people tend to associate words like boba and maluma with the round shape, and words like kiki and takede, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's a made-up word. Takede with the spiky shape. You're like, okay, that's cool, but like maybe that's just an English thing. Not true. This applies. It's been studied pretty robustly. People have a tendency, whether they're English-speaking folks in university, Tamil speakers in India, some speakers of languages that don't have writing systems. So it's not even like, oh, kiki's a spiky word as written, so it must be. Nope, not that. Young children, infants, some people who are congenitally blind. It applies pretty universally. And that's wild. This is one of many seemingly weird anecdotes from the game Zero Escape, but it's actually a real thing. It highlights this idea in linguistics that sometimes the sounds that we use are highly connected to the concepts of something. We use the word ding to describe the sound that a bell makes, but those two are just so intrinsically linked. Like, does it sound like what it does because of the concept or because of what we've named it? It's hard to tell the difference. In this case, we're like, I don't know, Kiki's kind of spiky, so it's a spiky shape. More generally, this shows the idea that sometimes things are connected in an almost universal way, even if they're not always explainable. That's sort of philosophy, neuroscience, but that's fine. Language is hard. Economics. I promise we won't do a lot of math. In fact, I'm going to show no math. We're just going to talk very broadly about things. And to make things easier, we're going to talk about economics through the lens of Smash. I have played a little bit of competitive Smash, and we can talk about, we're going to use Smash as the lens for this, but it applies to most competitive games, fighting games, other games like that. But I imagine for games or TV shows or whatever, you've probably seen like tier lists. These characters are good, these characters are less good. And so like, I think this is some official ranking from like top whatever players. It doesn't matter. Just like, here's a tier list, you can see it. In fighting games, though you can imagine similar competitive games, you can imagine that we want to compare different choices on a spectrum against some dimension. So like if we're talking about Smash, we might be like, I am considering what is the fastest character. We might talk about, we got Sonic, Mario, and Ganondorf. And Sonic is fast. Sonic goes fast. Gotta go fast is literally one of his catchphrases. In economics, there is a concept called Pareto efficiency. And given a bunch of different choices, finding the combination where the outcome is better in every possible way than the alternatives. And that also means that no alternatives make things worse for anybody else. It's more complicated than that, but we can talk about it very broadly like this. So in this context, we only have one choice to make. Who is the fastest between these three people? And it's Sonic. That's easy. But imagine we had a different situation where we have two different dimensions, like speed and power. Sonic is fast, but he's not that powerful. Mario is kind of in the middle. Maybe Ganondorf is super powerful, but he's really not fast. And then we have King K. Rool, who is like pretty powerful, but maybe not as powerful as some other folks, maybe not as fast. Pareto optimal are like the choices that are the best, and if you take all of them against all your different choices, you can build this thing called a Pareto front, which is like, these are the best choices. Anything beyond it is not attainable. Anything inside it is strictly worse than some of the other alternatives. Excuse me. If you can imagine a lot of competitive games, this is the reason why certain characters show up more than others. In this case, there's really no reason that you should play King K. Rool other than like you like him as a character. Because there are other choices that are strictly better. Now, you can extend this to different dimensions, like maybe it's speed and power or speed and power and difficulty. You can take this and apply it to choices outside of games. When we're talking about games, game designers usually try to design things in a way that choices are generally, you always have good choices, right? Doing the good option usually presents a benefit that might be similar to the evil option, not in terms of morals, but in terms of like power or some other dimension. You can also take this concept and take it outside of video games and apply it to like a capitalism. You might have dimensions where you can either do good or make money. And I'm not saying that this is what the curve looks like, but when you can think of circumstances through this lens, you're like, oh, I can understand why people are doing these things. If I'm going to do evil, I may as well make a crap load of money, is a great example. Because if I'm going to do evil and I'm not making a lot of money, that's suboptimal. Just a crappy way to look at it. But it's another lens to look at things. Pareto efficiency is neat. It's actually used in describing human welfare. The Wikipedia article is fascinating as I was digging through it. Okay, we're coming up on the end. We're going to talk about civics. And if you remember civics, there's different branches of government. There's legislative and executive and judicial. And I think civics is still a credit in high school. It's like a half credit. I don't know why it's a half, but that's what we got. So we're going to learn lessons about the judicial system from everybody's favorite ace attorney, Phoenix Wright. And as you all know, in our justice system, prosecutors work with the police. Trials have to take 3 days max. Perjury is totally fine. For those who don't know, perjury is lying when under oath. And you don't need evidence. That's totally a real... yeah, you're not convinced, and I'm not either. The Ace Attorney series is a lot of fun. It does not in any way represent a real life court system. I mean, it's a parody of the Japanese court system, and if you think about a lot of Law and Order types, you're like, oh yes, this would make things better. It wouldn't. It shows in a lot of ways what happens when you don't care about justice, when you don't care about things like evidence, and you care mostly about just pre-assigning outcomes. Bad person probably did bad things, so they should go to jail. Well, no, prove it. Did this person truly do a bad thing? These attorney badges are real, though. Yes, that comes up a bunch. Let's learn a better civics lesson. We have lots of choices. I mean, this one is not a positive one, but it is a lesson nonetheless. Let's talk about politics and fascism very briefly. This is a heavy topic. We're getting heavy, and I swear there's a reason for this. It's not just me getting dark towards the end, because that was a fun idea. In a bit of a more serious note, with a less concrete answer, there are lots of games that mostly through narrative teach us about real and imagined politics, and in particular about fascism, which is a far-right ideology. It's, often known for authoritarianism, extreme nationalism, the suppression of alternative thoughts. There's a dictator usually, but not always. It's like, do things for your country because I said so. It's not great. It's not great. And there's maybe too much of it right now. Papers, Please is a game where you're a border agent. And your job is to ensure the right people are let into the country. I say this in air quotes, not to be deliberately to mislead folks, but it's because the requirements change a lot. You start the game with a simple list of rules, check the passport, make sure that everything looks correct. And as the game continues, as events continue to transpire, the list gets longer and longer. You have to check more and more things. And are they all justified? Who knows? But your job is to be this border agent. And so it's tricky. Even when the checks seem reasonable, the challenge is you have to get paid. And you get paid based on the number of people you let in. So do you let in more people, even though you might not check them as thoroughly? That's like kind of political dissent, but also, got to feed your family. Like literally, your family will get sick or starve if you don't let enough people through. But also you can accept bribes, so maybe it's okay. I don't know. Like fight the power. I don't know. If this sounds bleak, the upside is that you do have some choices in the game narratively where you can decide to try to change things. Not always in direct ways, but there are different endings. It's good. It's still more of a game kind of game. It's a find and match game, but it's a game. 1000x Resist is a fantastic game, but it's more narrative driven. Like you can wander around and like take some actions, but it's mostly a walking simulator talking game. It talks about the story of a family that travels from Hong Kong to Canada to start a family during the 1980s Hong Kong riots. Their little girl grows up and is like fights against like, I don't want to be weird. I don't want to be like this foreign person. I want to like be like all the other kids in my class. And then aliens show up, and then she becomes a god, but not in that order. It is so much harder to explain than that. But what ends up happening in the game is the characters end up kind of repeating this pattern of authoritarianism, militarism, etc. And at one point in the game, it comes down to you get to decide the future of everything. And you have to decide what elements of the past make sense to hold on to and which ones to let go. And so it's just like we kind of can't move forward in some cases unless we confront the harsh truths of our paths. Sometimes that means erasing them, and other times that means accepting them. But it's a fascinating game. I include both of these games Not just because they're great games, they're great examples of this concept, but because they highlight even how when the world is really bleak and it feels like everything is on the verge of collapse, even in the never-ending trash fire of things, there are small and large acts that we can take to make things better. Sometimes they're acts of necessity, and sometimes they're acts of resistance. An easy example of this right now, as part of Kanchi, they're raising money for the Canadian Mental Health Association. A small way that you can try to help with that is to make a donation, or to spread the word about this. But as another example, if you happen to be in Ontario right now, there is a provincial election, and for folks across Canada, there will soon be a federal election. In fact, the election is going on Thursday, the 27th, and if you might even be able to advance to vote in advance polls right now. While every election is important, we're once again at a point where folks can choose to help each other and work together, or continue to ask, what's in it for me? How does that play out? You piece it together. But like, those are actions that we can take to avoid, I'm not saying that we're headed towards fascism here, but like, those are actions that you can take to prevent the world from being as much of a trash fire as it is. There are lots of games that I didn't get to, but I just wanted to highlight some here and quickly talk about them, so you can go check them out if you want. Silent Hill Shattered Memories actually has this neat mechanic where it gives you psychological tests and they change the game. You can learn a bit of psychology. There's a game that hasn't come out yet called Don't Fraud My Heart, which teaches you about finances and also is a dating sim. But there's also a game called Tax Heaven 3000, which is a real legitimate game you can play that will help you file your 2022 taxes if you're an American citizen, which is wild. It's also like a visual novel, if I remember correctly. Plague Inc., you can learn about biology and virology. Doki Doki Panic is kind of a spooky game, but I think it actually does a really good job of depicting depression, if you haven't seen that. Virtue's Last Reward, I wanted to talk about Schrodinger's cat, didn't have time, but we also could have talked about The Prisoner's Dilemma, a really fascinating economic concept in coordination games. To the Moon talks about neurodivergence. I won't say too much about that. The Signal State, I was going to talk about Fourier transformations, which is really complex math stuff, but it's a game where you get to do audio signal processing. And Baba's You probably could have been included with the programming suggested things, but it is kind of like a screws with your mind and also is programming. Oh, I did say Doki Doki. Sorry, Doki Doki Literature Club. Thank you. Man, that's kind of embedded in my brain. And that's it, which is good because I got like 5 minutes left, it looks like. If you want to check out other stuff that I do, all the information's here. I usually stream on Tuesday nights on Twitch at NT3RP. But there's also other stuff that I do because I want to see the good things out in the world, so I put it out there. And yeah, that's it for me.